Greetings everyone, this is Tanya, and we're going to go over some local wild edible and medicinal plants in the Washington, D.C. area. We're going to be focusing on plants we can find in the late winter, the early spring, as is the time period right now. One might think it's winter with the snow on the ground, even though it's late March, but that being said, let's proceed. Firstly, I want to say I'm not responsible for any injuries or illnesses that result from your actions. You are responsible to do your own research, and most importantly, use your common sense. This information is brought to you solely as an educational guide with the best of intentions. It is imperative to always properly identify a plant before you even touch it, let alone consume it. Use this information along with quality field guides, other reliable sources, and or a knowledgeable forager to assist you. Never rely on any one source when foraging for wild plants. First, we're going to talk about the pines, and I'm talking specifically about pine trees. I'm not talking about trees that are in the pine family, and I'm not broadly talking about trees that are evergreens, okay? So we need to differentiate those. We're talking about plants, which trees are plants, in the genus Pinus, which are in the pine family. And how we can identify those, we are going to find needles that occur in clusters. They're called a fascicle. We're going to find bundles of 2, 3, or 5. We're going to talk a little more about that. And before we proceed, this is some things I found online regarding edible pines. As you can see, there's a lot of misinformation out there. They say that edible pines include the black and red spruce. Well, neither of those are pine trees. They're in the pine family, but they're spruce trees. They're quite different. And they're edible in different manners. So we don't want to just overgeneralize. So we're going to focus right now just in the genus of the pine, okay? And they also list white pine, which that's a true pine. Slippery elm, which isn't even an evergreen, that's actually a deciduous tree. So we're not even, really off base there. Balsam fir, again, that is not a pine, it's a fir tree. And the yellow and the black birch, both of those are birch trees and they're deciduous. They're not evergreens, they're not cone bearing. So anyway, that being said, there's a lot of misinformation. Just keep in mind, this is repeated a lot of different places on the internet because people aren't doing their due diligence on these type of things. But they also do list the edible pines as being the yew. It's not a pine, but it is an edible. Norfolk Island pine, also not a pine, and not around our area. It's actually in the southern hemisphere of Australia and New Zealand. And the Ponderosa Pines. Ponderosa Pines, there isn't multiple ones. There's subspecies thereof, but those are just some other names for the Ponderosa Pine. We're going to talk about that. And there is a concern, but it actually is going to apply to cattle and not necessarily humans. But, you can be the judge of that for yourself. But you can definitely check those things out. So we're going to talk about how we can eat a pine tree, right? Because most people probably never thought that would be something they wanted to do. Now, pine trees, of course, we're talking evergreens. They produce pine cones. And how we're going to do it is the young shoots, the inner bark, the young milk cones. Now, that's only in emergencies. The needles, the twigs, and the pitch. Those are parts of that can be usable. Some are more palatable, and some types of pine trees produce, better pitch than others. So we'll talk about that. Okay, so the edible uses, all pines in our region, and I'm speaking of the Mid-Atlantic, Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia area, are edible. Some are better than others. The white pine is the best, in my opinion. What you can have is the tender new shoots. That's with the needles removed. You can save for making tea. That's the needles, of course, and high in vitamin C. We'll talk about that. And you can peel them, make them into candy like wild ginger. You can cut them into pieces, boil in a sugar syrup for 30 minutes, and then you get something kind of, interesting to have. Now, with making the tea, the fresh needles are, of course, best. Chop them fine, steep them with hot. Don't use boiling water. That will actually kill some of the polyphenols and the vitamin C in it. But if you just steep it, it's going to give you kind of, a citrusy with a pine kick type of taste. And you can use the light green needles, of course, are going to be the best. But if you're in a pinch, it's wintertime, use the older needles rather. And of course, in the springtime, you can get the pollen. And that's actually, it produces quite a lot. And if you go out to your car, sometimes you might see them coated in a yellow pollen. Most of it's from pine trees. And don't eat it from your car, though. And but anyway, the pollen you can collect. Take a little plastic bag, Ziploc bag out there. You can shake that in there. Be careful with the trees. They're living too. Let's keep them that way. And you can add in the baked goods. You can eat it raw. It's believed to have anti-aging properties, alleviate fatigue, and boost testosterone. It is so believed that you can buy it at health food stores, and the prices on it are rather expensive. I think the last time I checked, it was like $100 a pound. It's very expensive to get pine pollen. Anyway, you can do so if you want, or collect it out in nature. Just be careful where you're collecting. Make sure you get from a safe place. Make sure you're getting from a place where you're permitted to do so as well. And don't take all the pollen. It does need it. And in emergency situations, you can eat, by cooking the young milk cones. You can boil them. Of course, you want to keep those because we need that tree to continue surviving. And you can get the inner bark, the cambium layer. And never ring a tree. That will actually permanently damage it and it will die. So make sure just, get a patch on one side of it. It can fix that. And if you do get the cambium layer, you can dry it, ground it into a meal. You can use it as a flower extender. It is really nutritious, but you're going to have that piney flavor, less so in some of the more palatable pines. Or you can chop it up and kind of fry it like spaghetti. Keep in mind, it is very high fiber. You are eating basically straight cellulose, and it can cause issues with digestion if you have too much fiber. So make sure that you're doing something to offset that. Drink plenty of fluids, and also maybe combine it with some sort of medicinal plants that actually have a action that would make the opposite, and that way it would balance out, or consume in moderation. And of course, medicinal uses is going to vary by species and identification. We're talking evergreen trees. We're talking big trees out there. Some can grow to 150 feet tall. And we have the needle clusters that are going to be bounded in base into bundles of 2 to 5 needles. There are some that have 2 and 3 on the same tree. We'll talk a little bit about that. But I'm not going to get into any details. I'm going to keep this kind of high level because we're going to cover other plants. Again, we talked about the male cones. And the catkins are going to be the small pieces. We're going to see some of those. And the female cones are just going to be those larger, woody, seed-bearing things. Some of them can be very sharp. And that, of course, is where you're going to get your pine nuts. Many people eat those. That's from a type of pine tree we don't have around here. That's the more commercial kind. Though all pine trees do make pine nuts, just some are going to be too small to be edible, or they're falling out before you get them, or the animals eat them. So, it's not going to be necessarily the best. Now, the warning on Ponderosa Pine is it can cause miscarriage in cattle. You are not a cow, but keep that in mind. There's definitely something in there that is causing that. Of course, it's not killing the cows, but it is causing their offspring to die. So there's something to be concerned about. And now, with respect to some of the trees that are evergreens, cone producing, outside of the pine genus here, the Pinus genus, are the eastern hemlock. You can be used to make tea. Keep in mind, don't confuse that for the U, and that's Y-E-W. We're going to see some of those. And the inner bark from the balsam fir, the tamarack, which is an interesting cone-producing plant tree that actually loses its needles. So it's actually not an evergreen. Really interesting. You might find some, it's more of a northern species, but some of it does come down into our area. And the spruces, so you can use those. Those are only in emergencies. So those aren't really the ones, the firs for making teas and things of that nature. So anyway, that being said, this is the Ponderosa Pine. I just want you to be familiar with it. It's not really, not applicable considering it is not in our region. It is a western species. So if you're out west, which you may be at some point, or you maybe, know someone that is, just be aware of it. It's out there. And the Native Americans have been eating different parts of it for centuries, according to the historical records. And this just shows some of the subspecies and the varieties thereof and where they occur. They do a more mountainous kind of region in the Cascades, Rockies, Sierras, etc. So my favorite and a very easy one to identify is the eastern wine pine, because we talked about pine trees having the needles. They're going to be in a cluster. We have a cluster of 5. So anytime you see that, it's going to make it a little bit easier to identify. You're going to have a thin white, kind of a stripe on this. And as you can see, we'll see some of the trees here in a second. And this has a really long cone and up to 8 inches, which is, you might see that around. So if you see on the left-hand side here, we do have the needles in the cluster of 5. And you can just eat those raw. And if they're too fibrous, you can always just spit those out. I do that a lot whenever I'm outdoors and out hiking. It's very refreshing in a strange way. Now, this is some of the fresher things. As you can see, these are the little male catkins on here because it's early spring. They're going to produce pollen, and you can shake that off or just, kind of eat it raw if you're out there. And this is, of course, the native range for the eastern white pine. Of course, it's all throughout our region. And this just goes into what we've already discussed in general with the pine tree. You can read the medicinal uses here and how it was used historically. I'm not making any claims thereof, but you can do your own research on that and but you can use anything from the pitch to the twigs to make teas. You can use the pollen, of course, and they do sell the pollen for those said purposes in stores. And the inner bark was formerly used as a cough syrup ingredient, and the needles are often used now, so it still has some current uses in herbalism. And it just gives a little more about the white pine, which we've already covered. Just some pretty pictures from compliments of the public domain from the USDA. Next, we're going to talk about Virginia pine. It's actually one of the other common ones that are very easily to identify in our area. And we're going to see a shorter needle than we see, or needles rather, however you want to call it, than we're going to see with the eastern white pine. And we're going to see a slight twist to them. And these are going to be in bundles of 2. We're going to also see the red pine has bundles of 2, except for the needles are going to be significantly longer. Again, you can use them pretty interchangeably. It's just palatability issues. These are all safe for making teas and whatnot. So these cones are significantly shorter and smaller than you're going to find with the eastern white pine. And these are just some pictures of it. Very nice. And as you can see, it's in the palm of my hand. So that kind of gives a general idea about how big they are. The needle's a few inches, 3 inches, etc. etc. Maybe, I wouldn't go much more than 3, actually. And this is just the native range of the Virginia pine. If you're near Old Rag, there's a lot there. That's where some of those pictures were taken. And next we talk about the red pine. Now the red pine native range, it's called the Norway pine. It's actually further north, but you might see some that come down into here. What's actually pretty cool about the red pine is where you get fat wood from. So it's actually really good for kindling. And what you can see is a red tinge to a lot of the features of this tree, down to the bark, down to the catkins as well. And again, we have our needles and clusters of 2. And again, you see the redness there compared to the white pine, which had a much lighter catkin. So you can kind of think about those whenever you're out looking for it. And you're going to have an orange-red bark, and then it becomes reddish-brown as it gets older. Now we're going to talk about a poisonous evergreen, often used as an ornamental. We do have a native species around here called the Canada yew, but you might find a Pacific yew, especially in people's yards and things like that. It's definitely planted for privacy and stuff like that, and it's a very pretty tree, or shrub, depending on how you want to look at it. So this is just the native range for it. This is actually quite toxic. Please know your differences between a Canada yew and an eastern hemlock before you go out there and do anything with them, because as you can see, they also call this the ground hemlock. And we'll see, because a lot of the seedlings of this will grow on the ground, and it does in fact look similar to an eastern hemlock. So it could easily be misidentified. What's interesting about this is the needles will actually spiral around the twig, and then it'll kind of, they'll spiral in such a fashion that they'll actually kind of lay like they're flat. So it's a very interesting, and the way that, as you can see here, it appears flat, but the needles are spiraling around there, but yet somehow managed to be flat. It's pretty amazing. So if you look at this picture here, you can actually see some of the spiraling. Let me see if my mouse can cover it here. And so we'll go from there. Try not to use my mouse too much, because it actually does pick up the sound pretty easily with it being right by the mic. So I'll try to do it over here. Okay, and these are just some of the other yews that you might find in the area. You want to kind of keep that in mind. They state that the outer part, the Aero part of the fruit, is edible, but that seed is very toxic. Even though birds can eat it, they don't break down the outer coating that protects it from the poison. Our stomachs will break it down. And this picture here was taken a few years ago in Pittsburgh. And, as you can see, the similarities between that and the Canada yew. So you might, we don't need to worry about the details per se. We just need to know that they're poisonous, and we need not to eat them. So don't do the needles, don't do the bark. You can touch them, are completely safe for that, but don't use them for other reasons. So as you can see here, it's next to this pine, how small these are, how they're growing on the ground, and someone in the woods might confuse them with a hemlock. It is not a hemlock. So please, and I mean eastern hemlock, we're talking the pine trees. We're not talking the herbaceous plant of the poison hemlock or the water hemlocks. It's a whole other set of issues over there, which we know those to be poisonous. All right, so now we're done with that. We can actually talk about some herbaceous plants. And something that we're going to be seeing a lot of as spring is approaching. So if we're going to look at the clovers, the two ones we're going to look at right now is the red clover and the white clovers. Okay, so anytime we're dealing with clovers, we're going to have, unless you're lucky enough to find a 4-leaf clover or even a 5-leaf clover, we're going to typically have, 3 leaflets. They're going to be rounded. We're going to see some plants that have 3 leaflets that are heart-shaped, but those are the wood sorrels, completely safe for consuming in moderation, but completely different plants, completely different benefits, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. Just want to mention those just so you have them in your mind as we go forward. You're going to see a lot of white clovers growing around. Very good for the bees. That's how we get our clover honey. They get a lot of pollen from there, and it's quite delicious. It's very mild honey. Now, these are in the legume family, so a characteristic of things in the legume family is high protein. This is why cows eat a lot of them, and they do very well, and they produce, they're vegetarian, and yet they become big and strong doing so. Well, we are not cows, and we do not have the ability to break down these plant compounds for us to find them digestible. We don't have multi-chamber stomachs, but there are ways that we can actually prepare these to make the this plant to be digestible for us. And we can steam them, so that's going to help. Or we can gently boil for 5 to 10 minutes, or we can soak, or a combination thereof, in salt water. Use about a tablespoon of quality salt per quart of filtered water for several hours. So it depends on what your choices are in life. And the best for the leaves and things of that is to collect before it flowers for the best flavor in soups and stews. Now, once it flowers, we still have good use out of it if need be, but the best part after it flowers is getting the dried flower heads or the seed pods. They can grind into a nutritious flour or use as a flower extender. But of course, one of the best things is actually taking the flowers and making a really nice herbal tea out of it. Now, I use the term tea. Technically, it would be tisane, which is Tisane, but, for all intents and purposes, you know what I mean by an herbal tea. And the flowers can be smoked as an herbal alternative to tobacco or in an herbal blend. The flowers, again, have medicinal. Now, for the white clover, the medicinal benefits are going to be significantly different than the red clover. The white clover is going to be more for colds and flus historically and used for rheumatism, gout. Both have antioxidant properties, have been shown to be cancer preventative. Also has anti-parasitic benefits as well. So helminthic worms just means worms, basically. And the nice thing about white clover for a lot of people is it has a low content of phytoestrogens. But for some people, the phytoestrogens might be something that they want as part of, what they need for their body. But just to be aware and make sure that you understand that these plants are not commercialized. They're not cultivated. A lot of our cultivated plants have been cultivated to be sweeter, to be more palatable, but they've lost a lot of the medicine. Okay, so there's definitely a trade-off in both cases. So as we move to the red clover, we can see that the leaves are much bigger. You're going to have markings that are usually more pronounced, but again, still a lot of the same characteristics. Of course, they look pink-purple, but we still call them red clovers. And we're going to these are bigger. White clovers there's a couple different species or varieties of white clovers, but most of them are lower growing than we're going to find with the red clovers, which is good because then there would be more food. Again, you can use these in the same exact way, process them that way as we would a white clover. Again, difference is the high content of the phytoestrogens. That can be good for some, bad for others. Just be aware of it. Make sure you speak to a doctor if you're going to be consuming a lot of them, if that's what you would like to do. With respect to making a red or white clover tea, we're making an herbal tea or a tisane. You're going to add 1 to 2 teaspoons of the dried flower heads or 3 fresh flower heads to 8 ounces of hot, don't use boiling water, and you can cover and steep for about 30 minutes, 15 at a minimum usually. You want to cover because that keeps the volatile oils from evaporating into the air. You want to capture those. That's where a lot of the good medicine and the phytochemicals are. Enjoy drinking up to 2 to 3 cups daily as needed. Speak with an herbal practitioner or your doctor if you have any questions on that. Next up, we're going to talk about some docks. There are some docks in our country that are native, and we have a lot that have been introduced. These are 2 of the introduced species. So we have on the left-hand side the yellow, also known as the curly dock, and on the right-hand side we have the broadleaf dock. They also call that bitter dock as well. So a lot of names. That's why it's always good to be familiar with the Latin names, because you might go to one region of the country or another region into the world and they call it something completely different. Anyway, that being said, both of these are edible, and we are going to talk about some of the ways in which we can eat them and how we can use them. They're also very medicinal, especially when we're talking about the yellow dock, one of the most detoxifying herbs out there, along with the red clover, very detoxifying for the body as well. So on the left-hand side, we have our curly or yellow dock. You're going to see it's a biennial. So in the first year, it's going to come up as a rosette. In the second year, it's going to bolt up into a stalk, and then it's going to flower and go to seed. So, and then on the right, we have the broadleaf dock. And sometimes the broadleaf dock, you'll see red in, the kind of the stems, especially the midrib. And other times you won't. It just depends. There's variability, of course. And on the left, we have our curly dock. As we can see that it's wavy at the leaf margin. That's why they call it curly. The reason they call it a yellow dock is because if you were to take the taproot out, you're going to find out that it's actually quite yellow, very high in iron. So a lot of it for medicinal is used as a supplement for that purpose. Now, how we can use it, the young leaves are going to be good. What we can do is also get the seeds, capture those, turn those into a high fiber flower extender as well. And, this is in the buckwheat family, so you might be familiar with buckwheat, which is a gluten-free seed. And it's very quite a delicious grain, if you will. Grain, using that term loosely because it is a seed. And as we see, these are going to turn, when they go to seed, a very rusty kind of brown. You'll see them. They're going to be about 1 to 5 feet tall, depending on where you are. And if they mow them down early on, that thing's going to try to come back. You're going to see a very small one. And if it's growing in a very good area where it likes the soil, then you're going to see sometimes up to about 5 feet. It's more often to see around 3, though, about the average. So what we can use is the leaves, the roots, the seeds. So the leaves, spring and new leaves through midsummer, steam, sauteed green, pot herb. It's preferred over raws because these are high in oxalic acid. And that is going to actually bind with your calcium, thus causing you not to have as much calcium. And then when it binds with the calcium, it can lead to the formation of kidney stones. That can be very problematic because it's very painful to process those out. So that is the problem with oxalic acid. Of course, that's in spinach and other types of greens like that, beet greens as well. That said, you still want to keep that to a minimum and keep these things in mind, especially if you're someone that has issues with oxalic acid or the formation of kidney stones. Definitely this might be something that might not be the leafy green for you. And if you're going to eat it raw, combine it with onions and or lemon juice, it's going to help. And the seeds, we talked about the high fiber flower extender. Medicinally, you can read that as well, but poultices and the roots, we talked about that and about how it's good in cleansing. And this herb, as stated, does pair well with red clover, dandelion, and or burdock. All of those are actually very cleansing to the body. So next up, we're going to talk about its close relative in the same genus, the sheep sorrel. This is also an introduced. You're going to find this growing, but it's going to be very, very, very low growing. Okay, it's not going to be as tall as you're going to find with the yellow dock or the broadleaf dock. So you're going to find something significantly smaller, but this has a lot of medicinal benefits. But as far as edibility, sure, you can eat it, but it's actually not that much of a quantity as you're going to find with some of the larger species. That said, wanted you to be aware of it. You're going to have the similar type of the tiny greenish flowers that are going to turn yellow or reddish as the season goes. And you're going to find it in various disturbed areas, similar to where you're going to be finding the yellow dock or the broadleaf dock. And if you're out west, there's different types of docks throughout the country. Now, we have a close relative. It's the wild sorrel. It is not as common, but it is bigger than the sheep sorrel. You might find some of it growing where you are, and you might find the garden sorrel, which is deemed to be native or non-native. Nobody, it's kind of up in the air. And we don't have to concern ourselves with it. We're just concerned, can we find it where we are? And you can see some of the pictures on that. Okay? And we talked about how we can eat the sheep sorrel. Again, we're going to have that same issue with the high oxalic acid content, so keep that in mind. And I would highly recommend consuming in moderation, or at least I'll do that for myself. Salad, green, chop it raw. It's going to have kind of a citrusy, soury taste, hence the name sorrel. And this sorrel is not in the same family of wood sorrels, but that is where that name is coming from. It's that sour taste, okay? And you can have it as a cooked green, saute or steam, 3 to 5 minutes, similar to the way that you would make the docks, the other ones in this genus. And you can make a lemonade-style cold drink with this. You can steep the leaves and stems for 10 to 15 minutes with hot, not boiling water, and then sweeten the taste and chill. It's high in vitamin C. Sheep sorrel is actually very known to be quite a medicinal herb, and it's been used as a full cancer remedy for a very long time, and it's used by a lot of people in the alternative medicine, but we'll just kind of leave that off to the side. But anyway, the leaf tea does help. Anything in vitamin C is going to help your immune system. That's a given. We don't have to question that. That's been proven. And poultices you can make out of roasted leaves. They've allegedly used that for tumors and cysts. And decoctions. When we talk about decoction, we're talking about when roots are that. That's actually where you hard boil things. So when you're dealing with the above ground parts of plants, typically what you want to do is just steep that. We'd call that a tisane or an infusion. Anytime you're doing something with a dandelion root or sheep sorrel root or things of that nature, you want to actually hard boil to get that the medicine out of it and to get the flavor out of it. And this does have some astringent benefits when we're dealing with the root. That's why it would help with diarrhea and excessive menstrual bleeding. These are good things to know when you're out in the world, in the woods, what you can use medicinally, if you had a bout of this and how you could stop those type of things. All right, so now we're going to talk about the wood sorrels. There are quite a variety of them. We have on the left-hand side, we have the mountain wood sorrel. We have in the center the violet wood sorrel, and on the right-hand side, we have a yellow wood sorrel. Now, the first two are very rare. I do not recommend consuming them. Most often, you're going to find them in a space where you're not actually technically legally allowed to forage. I do highly encourage you not to do so for the sake of the plants and for the sake of you not getting fined. But anyway, with respect to the plants, this is the mountain wood sorrel. Look, they don't even look palatable. So let's just leave them where they are. They're quite beautiful, but they do have a mild, the sour taste, but they're not as tender. So as you can tell from that, and if you do give a little nibble, just don't take all of it. And I did find some of this, but I found this in Tennessee, North Carolina, and it's the only place I've ever found it. You might be more lucky than me, though. We're going to have, when we deal with the wood sorrels, we're going to have 5 petaled flowers. We want to keep those things in mind, and we're going to have the heart-shaped leaves. Those are going to be the key things that you can help identify a variety of a wood sorrel. They also call these wood shamrocks or sours because of the sour taste. Now, just like we saw with the sheep sorrel, we can make that lemonade style drink with this, but I'm going to show you the ones that are more palatable and everywhere, so you're not going to be harming a native environment. And that just shows the native range for the mountain wood sorrel. Now, here is the violet wood sorrel. I've only found this other one time, and this was in West Virginia this was in Hawks Nest State Park, which is right above the New River in the New River Gorge area. Very beautiful area. I think the latest national park to be added to the system. Anyway, this is going to see those. It blends in very easily with everything else. Also, this one has some neat markings on the heart-shaped leaves. And as you can see here on the left-hand side, it looks like there's something sticking out. Yes, it's a spider on the back of it. Don't be eating that. I would assume that would not be so good. And this just shows the native range for it, a little more expansive, though it is still rather rare as well. The yellow wood sorrels, now these are much more common. You're going to see a lot of variety. There's a lot of different species of it. On the left-hand side, you have the creeping wood sorrel. Sometimes you're going to see more purple coloration in the leaves, reddish in the stems than some of the other species. But again, they're all going to be edible for the purposes that we're going to discuss in a few minutes. So these are just some pictures and show some distribution of it. I see that according to the USDA that this is native in the United States, but once it crosses into Canada, somehow it becomes introduced. We'll just leave that at that. But anyway, that's what the green means on their diagrams is native. Blue is going to mean introduced or non-native. And when we see orange, it means both. Okay? That means basically they haven't figured it out. Or if you're looking at situations where you're looking at a whole genus, there could be some species that are native and some that were introduced. So this gives just some of the ranges for the slender yellow wood sorrel, the common wood sorrel, which are different. And this is just some pictures of it. Sometimes you'll see them outlined in actually like a reddish purple, not uncommon to see. But again, you're going to see the 5 petaled. You're going to see the heart-shaped 3 leaflets there. They're going to look similar to the clovers or shamrocks, but they are not. Sometimes you will see people actually, for St. Patrick's Day, actually use pictures of wood sorrels for shamrocks and, take it or leave it. It is what it is. And what's interesting about the seed pods is whenever they are ripe and you touch them, they will explode. Very cool, kind of fun. little game to play. And you have with the common Sorrel, how you can tell that is you're going to have a very erect seed pod that's going to be sticking up, and the bent stalk is going to form like a 90-degree angle. But again, that's just getting down into the details that are really not necessary. The question is, can we eat it or not? Yes, you can eat this. But again, the oxalic acid, you might want to keep it down to a moderation, trailside nibble, something like that. Maybe make a refreshing drink a few times during the summer, but do not rely upon this as your go-to like greens. For the summer, that would probably not be the best idea. But again, don't go overboard. So you can see about how you can use it medicinally. This is high in vitamin C as well. It's really delicious. A lot grows in my yard, and I eat it moderately though. So keep those things in mind. Next, we're going to talk about green briars. People might think, oh my gosh, briar bushes, they do have a use, right? So most of them, briars have thorns. That's why, we reference those. Where I came from, we call them jaggers. I don't know if anyone else does, but I grew up in the woods a little bit. And so we call it a lot of things by names that I find no one else calls. So maybe you call them jaggers where you're from. Anyway, you're going to see a lot of varieties here, and it has a lot of uses. Now, we don't eat the berries. These are going to turn into like a bluish later. They're very unripe, but we're not eating them ever, okay? They're inedible. Let's just put that out there. But what we can do is whenever we have the shoots that come up, we can eat those. The new growth, we can eat those. And more importantly, we can eat the rootstocks. So just think about one of the cattails, you can pound the starches out of that. You can do the same thing with the greenbriers. The greenbriers are to be a little sweeter, and you can do a little more with it, like making jellies, and also dilute it and make a mildly sweet tea. All this stuff is written here. You can take your time on that as well and go over it. But the tender shoots, you're going to have it raw, juiced, blended, sauteed, steamed like asparagus. The tender young leaves, tendrils, salad green, prepare like spinach, or as we've already discussed. They become too fibrous, you don't want to eat them. They're not palatable, but they're not poisonous. But again, it is what it is. And the rootstocks are going to be very gelatinous and things of that nature. So you might be able to add a little bit of that into your soups, maybe thicken things up a little bit if you would like. Add it as a flour extender up to about 50%, in a pinch. You never know where things are going to go. And if you're out in the bush, this might be all you got. So keep those things in mind. And identification, we're going to have leaves. They're going to be alternate simple with parallel veins. We did see some of that back here. A lot of varieties, like a little bit in the sheet, the way that the shapes of the leaves are, but you're going to have those common characteristics. Now you're going to have a green stem, no central pith. The pith, some of the things that we'll talk about are going to have different colorations, so it's going to be consistent. And you're going to have mostly prickly, thorny vines, climbing by tendrils that originate in the leaf axils. See if we can see any tendril action going on. Yeah, a little bit here. You can see the tendrils kind of going up there. So they're going to come out of the leaf axils, and that's a way that you can identify them from some of the other things that could be growing out there, grapes and whatnot. And we'll talk about grapes another time, and we're going to compare that with moon seed, but that's another day. So just keep these things in mind. You're going to find them in a variety of areas depending on the species. Swamp areas, you might find a laurel green briar. In the woods and thickets, you might find catbriar, roundleaf briar, bullbriar. The brownleaf briar and the catbriars are very common around here. The bullbriar is going to be a little bit more in the south region, but we might have some that would go far enough into Maryland and Virginia for us to find. Now, this is claimed to be the best species for using rootstocks to extract the starches. So now when you're getting the starches, desperation times, of course, is desperation times, but always when we're dealing with roots is always going to be late fall into early spring, as according if you can actually dig it out. If the ground is too frozen, that doesn't make it very easy. But after that first hard frost, all that energy from the leaves and all the sugar and the sweetness and the starch and the polysaccharides are going to be transferred back down in the root to be stored as, what a root does is a storage thing and store all that energy for the next year for the growth cycle. That's when you want it. That's when you're going to have the best flavor and you're going to have the most nutrition. A plant that's actually in that genus that actually can be used is the carrion flower. Now, the reason they call it carrion flower is because it smells like decaying flesh, and as you would expect, the fly is the pollinator for this. So, as they always say about flies, right? They're attracted to certain things. But anyway, what's interesting about the carrion flower type of variety here of the green briar is that there's no thorns on it. But I guess if you smell like that, you really don't need to basically deter too many people or too many of the predators from eating you. But you can still eat the tender young shoots, and we're talking about when the flower comes out that you're going to get that smell, because that again is to attract the flies. And so as you can read the things here, we're going to consume it in a very similar way as we would consume any of the other green briars, okay? And it's not going to be woody, so it does have some more palatability then as well. And I would stay away from the flowers, and of course we're going to have the bluish black berries, and you do not want to eat those, okay? Now we're going to talk about some mint family plants. There's quite a few in the spring, and they look pretty similar. All of them are safe to consume. Some taste better than others, but again, still all going to be fine. And they make nice teas. A lot of the mints do. Now, these aren't going to be minty as in spearmint or peppermint or anything like that. The characteristic of the mint family is square stems, opposite leaves, and aromatic. Those are three of the characteristics, but the other characteristic is the design of the actual flower. So you might have some other plants, like in the vervain family, that would have those characteristics of opposite leaves, square stems, and do have a scent to them. But the flowers are different, so not everything that has a square stem is in the mint family. So just kind of keep that in mind. But everything in the mint family does have a square stem. So this is how the creeping Charlie, or the ground ivy, they call it Jill over the ground as well. It'll grow upright in the spring as it's flowering, and then it'll spread out. It does spread by stolons, which are runners. So you'll find that if you pull one up, it actually might be going for quite a while, and you might have a multi-foot strand of them to pull up. Which I would say snip the leaves if you're going to get them. Don't pull up by the roots. Let this plant be able to come back. I mean, it's introduced and everything like that, but it's still really pretty, and it does make a good ground cover. It has been used for centuries for multiple reasons, including medicinally, edible, and this kind of indicates more how it's going on a vine here, and this is showing on the right-hand side that it does make a very dense covering and very beautiful little delicate flowers. So again, the young leaves and flowers you can raw in salads or steam. Leaves, juice blended, dried for tea, added to soup as a pot herb. And ground cover, again, you're going to see the stolons. We talked about that. And typically it's going to be more low growing, but it's going to go a little more upright as the flowers are trying to get that sun, get that energy, get pollinated and all that, So we know that it's been used to treat coughs, cold, bronchitis, fever. And again, we talked about the identification. The springtime lookalikes are the purple dead nettle and the henbit dead nettle, both safe for consumption. Both are mint family plants. They're not nettles. They call them dead nettles because the leaves look similar to nettles, except for there's no stinging hairs, so they call them dead nettles. Okay, you're going to find them in hedgerows, woodland margins, grasslands, my backyard, wherever. Anyway, here's some spring blooms just to show you the difference between the ground ivy on the left, the henbit dead nettle in the center, and the purple dead nettle on the right-hand side. All very beautiful. My least favorite to consume is the purple dead nettle. It's very beautiful, but I just don't like the flavor of it. It is, to me, tastes kind of musky, or I don't know, just not my thing. Might be your thing though. Everybody has a different, likes different things. Now we're going to talk about jewelweed. Jewelweed is more of a medicinal than, in my opinion, an edible. But in an emergency situation, it does have some edible uses. And it does have a little bit of a trailside nibble use. But it's not exactly like, going out and getting dandelion greens where you can make a large batch of them. Or garlic mustard or something of that nature. But it's something to be aware of and to know. Because if you're out foraging, it's best to know as many plants as possible. And this one actually has a very good use for a treatment or prevention. It would be more accurate for poison ivy. It does help with stinging nettle a little bit. I don't think it helps us. It doesn't help me that much, but I guess some people it helps a little bit more. Now, as we saw, we had the orange dead jewelweed rather, and they call it touch me not, because these seed pods, whenever you touch them, they will pop and explode. So it's very cool. It's neat how it just sort of hangs there. These will grow taller than me sometimes, but typically 3-4 feet tall, and they are native to the area. You'll see yellow jewelweed and orange jewelweed, in the same environment. Sometimes you'll see all yellow, sometimes all orange. It just depends where you are. And as we see on the left-hand side, we see some poison ivy. So often they're growing near each other. And you'll see the jewelweed. It's going to grow. It likes it, it likes its feet wet. I mean, it likes dampness. And so moist woods near where there's water, along rivers, creeks, etc., along bike paths. You'll find it in a lot of different places. Now, when it grows up in the spring, you're going to have these little two leaves that look quite different than what it'll actually expand into. So, keep those things in mind. It's good to know the plants when they're young because they do have different uses then. As we see here, when jewelweed grows, it grows. There is a lot of it. So if you were to take one of the plants and break it off, it's very, has a lot of moisture in it, high water content or liquid content, and you can put that on you if you come into contact with poison ivy. And what I mean by that is poison ivy, what it is caused by urushiol, which is an essential oil type that's in the poison ivy on the leaves, especially when they're fresh and young. If you break that and get that on you, that's going to be quite a problem. And it can go airborne. Like if you're out there mowing, the leaves are very fresh. It can actually go into the air, especially if there's humidity, and it kind of, you're kind of walking through almost a terrible situation if you were me, like I did once, and I got it from head to toe, anything that wasn't covered, because they had just mowed a lot of it, and I had just taken a shower, so I had fresh skin. So maybe before you go outside, don't just take a shower and then go play in the woods. You want to have those natural oils on your skin act as a natural barrier to protect you. But if you do come into contact with it, you want to get that urushiol off before it actually is able to penetrate your dermal layers. One way you can do it if you're outdoors and don't have access to soap and a washcloth to kind of scrub that off is you can break up this plant, and it is going to act as like a soaping agent, very mild, of course. A lot of plants have saponins in them, which would be natural soaps, if you will. And that's going to break down those oils so it cannot go into your skin, into your dermal layers, and then cause that rash, okay? So these are some reasons that maybe some people don't get poison ivy, because maybe they don't shower for a couple days and they're out in the woods. You're going to have a natural protection. And so, not saying one way or the other. Now, edible, it has limited uses. One must cook parts to overcome the potentially harmful compounds. If you are going to have the young shoots up to about 6 inches, you want to do it in 2 changes of water, and don't consume that cooking water. Throw that out and start over. Best thing to do to keep things from becoming bitter when you're doing things like that is dump out the water and add hot water again. Don't add cold water and wait till it come to a boil, because you're going to fix that bitterness, okay? Plus, it's going to take a really long time to cook your food. But that's definitely a process. So this isn't the most easy one to deal with. It's very beautiful, though. I love how in the spring it goes from like a blue green to a green, and the leaves completely just change shapes. Quite a interesting thing to see it morph like that. Anyway, the seed pods and the seeds, or trailside nibble, you can taste them. They're very interesting. They kind of taste like a mildly bitter version of walnuts. So if you're out there and want to experiment, that is something that I do at least once a year, and they're okay. It's just interesting. And medicinally, internally, no, don't use that. But topically, again, the juice from the stems. Some people will make soap out of it, or sprays and stuff, and they think that if they put it on before they go outside, that's going to protect them. I mean, maybe it will. It's up to you to do with it what you will. Again, this gives you ideas on how to make a spray or a salve if you were so inclined. And again, it's supposed to help alleviate the symptoms after the rash occurs as well. Next, we're going to talk about common milkweed, and we're going to compare it against the dogbanes. Dogbanes are poisonous. Do not eat them. And a lot of milkweeds are also poisonous, so keep those things in mind. Also, you have to process this in a particular way. You can't just eat this raw. So this needs to be cooked, and you need to do the changes of water. Now, we also want to keep in mind that this plant is the food of choice for the monarch butterfly. So we need to make sure there's a lot of this growing, so be very mindful of that. But it is a really interesting one. I haven't eaten it yet, but I'm going to try some this year, actually. And as we see just some of the different life cycles of it, I'm going to try it in this early spring as a shoot. And we're going to look at how it is very similar looking to the dogbane. So you want to make sure that you know exactly what you're doing before you're out foraging for this. Keep in mind that some of the differences in characteristics come down to the flowers, the seed pods. I mean, all aspects of it. And of course, even the venation of the common milkweed. We're going to look at some comparisons in a moment after we go over the edibility and the medicinal uses of the common milkweed. Now, in the shoots, early spring, before the flowers pop out, it's going to be like asparagus-like. You can, the top leaves, you can make those as a cooked green. The unopened flower buds, the young seed pods, you can make those as a cooked vegetable. And we're going to cook them in similar fashions. We're going to boil them in 15 minutes in several changes of water. Okay, and it's best to change the water a lot in the first few minutes because you want to get those bitterness and those kind of bad things out the door. And always add back boiling water, not cold water, so we're going to set that bitter flavor in. We don't want to do that. We want to get that out. Another thing that you can do is the flowers. You can make them into fritters. And fritters are just things that you're dipping in batter and frying. We can do that with dandelion flowers and a lot of other things as well. And you can boil in water for a minute, drain, dip in batter, and fry until golden brown. I think I might try that this year as well. And medicinal use, you can use the roots and the latex. The roots were used for gravel. That's also kidney stones, so maybe we want to keep that thing in mind if we eat too much of the plants high in oxalic acid, I guess. And this does act as a diuretic, so it helped with edema. They used to call that dropsy back in the day. Expectorant, so it helps with lungs, induces sweating, helps asthma and rheumatism, or so they say. The latex, that's going to be the white milky stuff that's going to come out of it. People have used it historically for warts, moles, ringworms, things of that nature. Ringworms are not actually worms. They're a fungal infection. It just looks like a worm under the skin. That's why they call it that. And it was a folk cancer remedy as well. Now, some older texts claim it to be potentially toxic due to cardioactive compounds, but likely due to confusion with the dog banes. Not saying that there's not toxic compounds. We definitely want to boil those off. But it's not having the same characteristics as this plant. But they look so similar. They grow in the exact same area. So it can be very easy for somebody to get these confused. Okay? Especially if you're hungry. Then you act a little more delirious as your blood sugar's low. Let's be safe out there, okay? Now this one is safe to touch, but not to eat. Now, with safe to touch, this is actually one of the best things for cordage. They make nets out of it, and it's been used forever. You can, touch this and do a lot of things in the bush with it. So it's definitely a good one to know for that purpose, and it's also a good one to know so you don't get it confused with the milkweed if you are so inclined to try it. So make sure that you study this one well. Make sure you go out there with a forager so you can actually see it. Make sure you get to know this one before you ever, consume either one. It's always a great idea, not good idea, probably necessary idea, to know the poisonous lookalikes for the plants if they exist. You do not want to make a fatal mistake. Now, when we first looked there, we were looking at the Indian hemp. That's it's a hemp dogbane, a type of dogbane. I'm just going to flip back for it. We're going to see some differences here. So just keep these in mind. You might see it with white flowers, as we see with this one. You're going to see the seed pods there. Or you might find a spreading dogbane. It's going to have pink flowers, same kind of shape. Or you might find the hybrid between them, which is the intermediate dogbane or the medium dogbane. And that could have pinkish, whitish, never know how it's going to turn out, right? So all going to be used similar fashions and all not to be ingested, okay? Now, they have used it medicinally, and some people still do. We'll talk about that in a minute. But again, I would not recommend that you are not a master herbalist or of that nature, or maybe someone in the Native American community have been using it for a very long time that knows how to do this. But some people do use it for the fact that it is a cardiac glycoside and it helps with heart rhythm, and it helps with as a cardiotonic. Again, too much will kill someone, so we want to be very mindful of that. Do not use it without the guidance and supervision of a qualified herbal practitioner, of which I know no one that would necessarily fit that I would use that from, but that's up to you to make that decision for yourself. Again, it makes excellent cordage. It's used for hunting nets, fishing lines, clothing, twine, very strong, high quality fiber obtained from the bark. It's flax substitute that does not shrink and retains its strength in water, so that's very important. And the latex from it is a possible substitute for rubber as well. Okay? And you're going to find it in the same place. And this is just showing on the left, the native range for the common milkweed. On the right, we have the range for the hemp dogbane. As you can see, it is very widespread. And here is the range for the spreading dogbane and the intermediate dogbane. Now, this is just some comparison between the two, just to kind of show how they look different at different times. They're very hard to tell apart. Now, as the leaves come out like this, they become much easier. when we look at the veins, they're significantly different. So as you can see, they kind of crisscross and they connect along the side here for the milkweed, but they don't do this for the dogbane. And you have a wider leaf over here. But again, if you don't have them to compare against each other, they can be very easily confused, okay? So make sure you're just aware of the things. Also, a good way to identify is look at what's around. Do you see some old seed pods growing around? Do you see last year's growth that's all dried? That'll help you identify. I mean, if you're thinking it's milkweed and all you see is, the dead dogbane around, you might have to start thinking maybe it's dogbane you're looking at, okay? So this just shows some of the difference between, we have the seed pod of the hemp dogbane on the right. We have the seed pod of the milkweed on the left. And this just gives a little diagram here that shows the differences between the three species of dogbane that you might find in this area, and just talks a little bit more about some of their features. The one thing about milkweed versus dogbanes is dogbanes is going to be branching, so it's going to be more shrub-like. It's not a shrub, but it'll be shrub-like. Whereas milkweed is normally going to be a single stalk coming up, okay? And that's normally. Sometimes you might see a little branching, so don't be surprised if that happens. I've seen it. And here is just to show the difference between the common milkweed and the butterfly milkweed. You do not want to consume the butterfly milkweed. It is quite beautiful and it has a lot of uses, especially for the animals, but it is not something we want to consume. Now, how you can tell the difference, one, the leaves are completely different, the flowers, completely different colors, but also with the butterfly milkweed, you're not going to have that milky sap. You're going to have watery sap, okay? And you're going to have rough, hairy stems. Whereas the milkweed, you're going to have smooth stems, okay? The milkweed, you are going to have leaves are going to be hairier on the other side. Whereas the butterfly milkweed, you're going to have short, fine hairs on the leaves. So that's going to be above and bottom. Now, this shows a little bit of the differences between the dogbanes and the milkweed. Just about, oftentimes with the dogbane, you're going to have the stems being reddish, but you're going to see right here on the left that there's some reddish, pinkish in the milkweed as well, okay? And again, shrub-like versus mostly, typically unbranched. Dogbanes, all parts are toxic. Don't eat it. And, you do want that sap out of the milkweed that you want to get rid of. That's why we do the boiling, okay? And dogbanes are going to be hairless. But don't be surprised if there's fine hairs, like small, if you get out a loop or anything like that. Most things aren't typically 100% hairless, okay? So this is the butterfly milkweed. They call it pleurisy root, and because it's been used medicinally for this type of things, but we are not talking about the medicinal. We're just going to appreciate it for what it is, and we're not going to confuse it with our common milkweed. And as you can see, the stem is super, super hairy, and it's the leaves are coming out in a different fashion. They're more alternate than you're going to find with your common milkweed. Again, you're going to have the very center, the type of seed pods are going to be similar to the milkweed. You don't want to get those confused because that might be after it's done flowering. So make sure you're aware of things. Now, the Cherokee used the fibers of this, the fashion belt, so it does have, those type of things. Now, there has been some historical use where people actually ate it for medicinal purposes, but it can be toxic in large quantities. And how much is large? I have no idea. I would just recommend avoiding it. Next, we're going to talk about ramps, and we're going to look at some of the lookalikes that you don't want to be eating. One is poisonous, and the other two are kind of questionable. So just make sure you know what you're doing. This is in the allium, family here, the genus rather. It is in the lily family actually, but it's going to be in the allium genus. That's going to be for your onions, your chives, your garlics, okay? So this is going to smell like those, okay? So if you're looking at something and you break off a little piece and you crush it, I'm going to recommend if you are new to a plant and you're crushing it, do not crush it between your hands. Do not crush it on your exposed skin. Take a little stick or a rock, put it on the ground, and then crush it and smell it, okay? Don't get that sap on you because if it is a poisonous one, that is not something that you want. There are a few plants in our area that the sap, if it gets into a cut or something like that, can actually kill you. So not trying to scare you, but we've talked about that during the poisonous section. Make sure you check that out on Monk's Hood. And also on Hellebore, false green Hellebore, actually, to be specific. So this is what ramps are going to look like. They're going to be very wilted. So if you do get to an area where the ramps have flowered, I'm going to slide back to that for a second. If you get to where it's flowering, I'm going to tell you the leaves are going to be brown on the ground, wilted, and they'll be hard to find. So if you come out into the woods and you see this little white flower, you might think to look for the ramp leaves. Now, the bulbs are edible, but if you do take that bulb, guess what? The plant is gone. You have just taken it. So keep those things in mind. This is very over harvested. And in my opinion, I think this is more trendy than anything. I mean, they are good, but if you cannot, keep the population growing and do it in a sustainable way, we do not forage for these. You use it like leeks in cooking. They are actually called wild leeks. The bulb you can do as a cooked vegetable, raw in salads or on sandwiches, pickled, similar to the way that you could do, your garlics or your onions. And we have our leaves fresh, cooked green, alone or added to soup. People like it in potato leek soup, type of deal. Raw in salads or on sandwiches. The leaves, you can dry them, use it as a seasoning, or add it as a pot herb later and reconstitute it. Medicinally, you're going to use it like wild garlic, but it's going to be less potent. Might be a good choice for some. Again, just talks about how they identifies. We want that smell of onion. Do not forage for things and eat them. There could be death camas. There could be a lot of things you might confuse for any of those. There's more plants out there that are not edible in our area than are edible. So don't worry about all that. Know the heavy hitters that are poisonous and know what you can eat. And it's stuff in the middle. Just appreciate it for its beauty. Now, this one is a white Clutonia. And there is no information on whether it is edible or poisonous, even though there is information on another member of this genus that is stated to be edible before the leaves unfurl. Well, that would be hard to tell it apart from a lot of things. So I would just recommend not eating any of these. They're pretty rare. They're threatened in some areas, so we don't want to harvest them anyway. And that said, we don't want to confuse these for ramps, think we're getting ramps, and then actually take away a plant that is threatened or endangered. So keep those things in mind. Now, they are, this is called blue bead lily because of the little blue berries that grow on it as the fruit ripens. Now, what we have here is American lily of the valley. Now, you are going to find this here. It is native. On the left-hand side, we have the American version, but on the right-hand side, we have an illustration of the European. How you can tell the difference is the flowers are going to be higher than the leaves on the European, and they're going to be shorter than the leaves, as far as where they emerge on the American version. Used similarly as far as in perfumes, making maybe hand salves, but this does have that cardiac glycosides, and it's highly poisonous if consumed by humans or animals. We do not want to have heart issues where it could either stop your heart or something of that nature, okay? So be mindful of that when you're out going for the ramps. It's very, very beautiful. These were taken in Ohio Powell State Park in Pennsylvania, I believe last spring, April, May-ish type of deal, whenever I was hiking through there. From a distance, I was so excited. I thought I saw like a field of ramps. And as I approached, I was disappointed, but it is what it is. But from a distance, it absolutely looked like ramps. And I was very excited, but alas, it was not meant to be. And they're not really my favorite, but I was still hoping to see some more. And he had that little patch that I know that I can go get pictures. And, it is what it is. But I was excited to find a new plant to get some pictures of. And this just shows the distribution range for the different plants that we just spoke about, which were the two Clutonias and the American Lily of the Valley. So you can see the American Lily of the Valley has a very short, limited range. So you might find around some of it. All right, next up, after that harsh transition from one plant to the other, maybe we want to smooth that out a little bit. We have violets. So violets are very interesting. There are, people might say, oh, violet leaves. Well, as we're going to see, some of the violets don't have leaves that look similar to each other at all. Most often they're talking about the common blue violet as the typical shape of that. Violets there's about 400 to 500 species in the Viola genus, and they call everything in that genus violets. That's okay. Now, we can eat all of them. Some are more palatable than others, and some do have an issue that the yellow ones especially, are more cathartic, which could means it's going to make you go to the restroom. And you might not want that, but maybe you do. I don't know. Anyway, there's native and non-native species. We're going to look at some of the ones as we see that we have white violets, yellow violets. We have hybrids between them. And that's the other thing. You can actually, merge these. That's why we have a lot of the common blue violets that'll have white and blue, because you can literally make them that way. I have an acquaintance who actually used to take the violets in her yard and actually try to hybridize those. Anyway, this is the common blue violet. These are the leaves that are the best for consumption. And on the right hand side, we have the sweet violet. So the leaves aren't as tender, but you're, going to see some differences with that. But the common blue violet does have some nice tender leaves, and in my opinion, the best for eating as a salad green, I prefer more as a salad green to eat raw rather than steaming them, but to each their own. You can also eat the flowers. You can make them candied, and stuff like that. It's a very tedious process in my opinion, but you might have more patience than I do for such things. I'm more of a just eat it raw type of person when it comes to this. But this just shows some of the variation in the different leaves. This is the Aero leaf violet, which, as its name suggests, its leaf is like an arrow. And just as you can see, there's a lot of hair on it, not very palatable, and not something that we want. And here we have the spear-leafed yellow violet. And again, this is quite a difference in the leaves. And you'll see some coloration differences as well. And then, of course, the birdfoot violet as the leaves here. Now, this is very rare, and a lot of these are, especially with the yellow ones as well. The yellow less so, but the birdfoot definitely very much so. Please don't forage this. I mean, most often you're going to find it in protective areas anyway, so you're not legally permitted to. I just say appreciate these. I mean, the common blue violet is the most palatable and most delicious, and it is literally everywhere. My yard, in a very short time, actually they started coming out, now there's snow, but anyway, it's going to have a lot because I encourage that kind of thing, so I can eat them. And anyway, the birdfoot violet, you're going to find Shenandoah, Great Falls, and I did find some pictures at Shenandoah last April when I was there, which was very exciting. So this is actually from that. I was very delighted to find it. It's such a beautiful little delicate plant. So I just say appreciate those, and the common blue ones are definitely the ones that would be best for consuming. But, in a desperate situation, you might have to do that. So anyway, we talked about how to use it. And of course, this is one of the ones you could use as a poultice for skin abrasions or boils. Leaves as a tea. It helps blood purification for skin issues, similar to some other plants. I do want to throw a note out there for the common periwinkle. Please do not confuse this with a violet. It does not look like one, but a lot of people, newer to the things, a lot of things look alike. So it took me a long time to learn a lot of plants because I really took my time and made sure that I did not make any mistakes and doing so with identification, especially if I was going to eat it. And so this is very common. It's non-native. It's been introduced as, a yard ornament as a ground cover, and it makes a beautiful one, and it makes very beautiful flowers. They do come out and emerge in the early spring, and this is very poisonous. It's extremely toxic. It's toxic to your animals. It's toxic to you. Do not consume this one. As you can see, it is very widespread in its non-native introduction to the United States, and it spreads into the woods. It escapes from lawns and into your area. So please keep those things in mind. We're going to talk about lamb's quarter. This is not one that's going to come up. It's kind of transitioning more from the later spring, but just wanted to throw that out here. You'll find this kind of growing in your gardens, possibly. It is absolutely extremely nutritious and very widespread, and they call it wild spinach. It's in the same family. It's also the amaranth family. You might be familiar with quinoa, amaranth, things of that nature. That's all going to be in the same area. You can eat that. It is very, very, healthy and nutritious. The nice thing about this plant is we actually have the nutritional profile from the USDA because it is definitely, they've done an analysis of it. And with it, it's going to be very high in calcium. You're going to see usually a lot of it growing. This is the picture on the left-hand side is you're going to see that the leaves are whitish on the underside. You're going to have a white coating on it. And typical, they call these things goosefoots in that family because allegedly, in people's, minds, the leaves look like a goose's foot. I guess, sure, if that's how you go with it, I see no reason to dispute that. I can see where they would get that. Now, again, you can do the seeds just like you could amaranth at some other point. We can discuss amaranth, but not right now. But you can eat them in the similar fashion. So if you do find some, they call it pigweed out there. There's green amaranth. There's thorny amaranth. There's so many different types. Anyway, that's a whole other topic, but they can all be used interchangeably. So kind of know some of the characteristics of those plants, and then it'll kind of help with identification if you start realizing, this looks very similar to this. Maybe they're related, and that's usually likely the case, right? So the edible uses: leaves, raw in salad, steamed, sauteed, added to soups, casseroles, added to smoothies, juiced. The leaves dehydrated for later use. Highly encourage that. I'm definitely going to do some of that. You can blanch it. You can freeze it like spinach. The seeds you can use like amaranth. Make it into a porridge. Grind it into a flour. Very high protein. And the leaves, a poultice, burns, reduce inflammation, relieves itching. Cold herbal tea, used to treat diarrhea. Leaf seeds, nutrient booster for sure. High in vitamins and minerals. Now, it resembles what's known as Mexican tea. They call that epazote. I would assume it's pronounced epazote. That's how I pronounce it. I could be completely wrong. Please correct me. And it's used in medicinal herb or seasoning only. It doesn't taste as good. So if you have something out there that is like that, it's not poisonous, but it's actually used for a lot of things like tea of life or something, I think, is what is the epazote. But that's a whole other, topic. I will put a video out specifically on that. And that has a lot of medicinal benefits, but it's not exactly the same thing. You're not going to get a mild taste. It is commonly used in Mexican cooking as a really interesting flavor for those purposes. And this is the USDA's breakdown of actually what's in lamb's quarter. So 3.5 ounces. Value of it, you're going to get only 43 calories, so some leafy greens. But in that a little bit, you're going to get 4.2 grams of protein, which is pretty significant. Good amount of vitamin C, almost 100% of your, USDA daily value of it, which is probably more than an orange. Oranges, we think they're high in vitamin C, but there's a lot of other things much higher. But look at the calcium content. 31%. That's absolutely huge. And again, you've got the magnesium, 10%, very good. Manganese, 37%, which is excellent. And, good source of potassium as well, which is hard to get, much more than, I'm sure, a banana. I think you have to eat, or maybe on par with the banana. So anyway, it does have a lot of really, really good nutrient that we need. So this is definitely a good one to know. And it doesn't have kind of all the warnings that we would have with a lot of the things with oxalic acid and all that other stuff. So anyway, in the previous one, we covered things like dandelions and the other. So please definitely check out part 1 if you haven't. And anyway, I just want to give some credits that the black and white illustrations, they are from the USDA. Please do check out. That's a great resource. It's the database. And the colored illustrations, they were in the public domain, and you can definitely check them out. I really am much gratitude to these great artists and botanists who have put in their time, and what an amazing work. So I do thank you for this. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you do have any questions, please do let me know. All right.